Kia ora, Vicky. Tēnā koe. Tēnā koutou katoa, he mihi nui I te mana whenua, tēnā rohi, Ngāti Whātua. He mihi nui ki a koutou I tēnei rā. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, kia ora tātou katoa. Yes, the gizmo. It's a tremendous honour to be standing here to give the John Dobson Memorial Lecture for the first time. And I'm hoping that this lecture will continue for many years and will remind us of some of the wonderful qualities of John Dobson, which we're going to hopefully talk about over the next 3/4 of an hour. Yes, it does work. That's great. Before I get underway, I want to invite up Rhonda Robertson. I want her to have the first word about John Dobson. So without further ado, thank you, Rhonda.
Kia ora, everybody. Thank you, Doug, for creating space for me to acknowledge John. And I do it not on behalf, just on behalf of myself, but there were a number of other people who were actively involved in a number of consumer issues that John was very passionate about. And it's quite ironic, actually, because my previous presentation with a colleague, we were talking about trauma-informed and what was helpful and what wasn't. And so in preparation for that, I was going through all my documents as a hoarder, I have plenty, and I pulled out this 1996 writings of John Dobson. What John used to do was he was very passionate about the people who had addiction problems, and particularly opioid substitution, and was very much involved in bringing that into New Zealand. And without him, and I talked about what was helpful earlier today, and what was helpful was having people validate our experience. John used to validate our experience, and even though he could do in his own right as an expert, he never did. He referred to literature, and he'd provide us handouts of all the literature that supports what he was saying. So he never spoke as I am the expert. So he was extremely humble, and he was just so compassionate. And I think when you're thinking about leaders, I know that he had a big, massive impact on your career. So, and I know that you have a big impact on a number of other people coming up through the sector in their career. So I think as a legacy, that's pretty impressive. Yeah. So I just want to thank you, Doug, too, because Doug was also one of those people that validated my experience, our parents' experience, as other people did at NAC. So I thank you too. Kia ora.
So we've got the pioneering psychiatrist. The thing about John was, in terms of pioneering, he pioneered opioid substitution treatment in New Zealand, but at the same time, he pioneered therapeutic communities and was behind the development of Odyssey House in Christchurch and supported the Parallel House in Auckland. And at that time, there was a large debate between those who really believed the only way to recover, the only worthwhile addiction treatment is through abstinence. In other words, a therapeutic community approach, while at the same time he was advocating also for what was then called a harm reduction approach, which some people saw as a soft option, the hard option and the soft option. And he bridged that gap and helped a lot of us at that time, we're talking 30 years ago, to think broadly in terms of the different ways in which we can intervene and help people with addiction. It was a tragic end. He died in a house fire. Rhonda and I both were at his funeral. There were 300 people there. There were 12 speeches. It went for 3 hours. It's the only funeral I've been to where there were 2 smoking breaks. It's quite extraordinary. There were 20 or 30 tangata whaiora there, and also his partner at the time who had nicotine addiction. I think it was Barbara actually who insisted on the breaks. So what he inspired in the people around him were I think, these 5 things. First of all, to endeavour to see the world through patients' eyes. The empathy that he had for people was really remarkable, and it was inspirational. He also had this passionate feeling for the literature, and constantly were asking and cajoling us with things to read. And he always listened to consumers, and that, I think, was the central sort of legacy. And I think he pioneered the whole issue of peer support workers and our field being really motivated and informed by lived experience. Many people actually only know Job Dobson for that 4th one, to be brave, speaking out on different issues. And he spoke out about abortion reform, prison reform, support for single parents and the poor, were things that I was aware of. And finally, he enjoyed life. We enjoyed, in the days that I could see, I played golf. It's a celebration of the total meaninglessness of life, I know, and therefore should be practiced often. And we did. And in fact, the last time that I saw John alive was on the Russley Golf Course. We went out at about 4 o'clock. It was in May. And I said to John, "Oh, we're not going to get 18 holes done, are we?" And he said, "Oh, don't worry, let's just go for it. See how far we get." And we got through the first 9. The 10th, it was getting pretty tricky, and we both teed off on the 11th and couldn't find our balls. So we went home, and he died soon after that. In thinking about what to talk about, I decided to sort of imagine if John walked in the back door there and suddenly appeared amongst us 20 years later. What would he be interested in at this current time? What developments? And undoubtedly at the top of the list for me is alcohol law reform, or perhaps I should say alcohol non-reform. He would be most interested in cannabis law reform. He would have been riveted by Hini Moore's awesome presentation about that, and really thinking through his, has he read all those papers? Actually, I'm sure he would have, Hini Moore. I also thought that John was here. I'd want to go back and we'd talk about that old chestnut issue, and I want to go through that a little bit, inpatient versus outpatient treatment, and touch on George Vaillant, a biggie in the field, whose influence has been tremendous, and then a little bit forward thinking into food addiction. So John lived through that big change in tobacco. I remember him talking about Sir Richard Dole's work on the cancer association with cigarette smoking, and we've had wonderful reforms in New Zealand around tobacco. But he was one of the pioneers of this new scourge, which is the heavy drinking culture in New Zealand, and the way in which it used to be a sign of success for a woman to have a cigarette in her mouth. She was one of the in crowd. Now it's holding a wine glass. If you're in public with a glass of wine, you're one of the in crowd. You're one of the successes of our society. And this is what we're all being brainwashed to think at the current time. And John was in on this. Back in the 80s, there was the Laking report, which ignored the evidence at the time that in making alcohol more available will increase the harms. Sir Roger Douglas was very happy to accept this report and others, and a liberalisation of the law came about, which got particularly turbocharged by Dame Jenny Shipley in 1999, when beer was introduced into supermarkets in New Zealand, which brought about a significant lowering of the price of alcohol, discounted alcohol, and also a drop in the purchase age. And notice in this picture with Dame Jenny Shipley, there she is at a conference with a glass of wine in her hand, showing that she is a very successful modern woman. John loved evidence, and you can see on this slide that alcohol reached its peak actually in 1978, around about the time that the Alcohol Advisory Council came into being. I don't think that this slide and the per capita consumption of alcohol was entirely due to ALAC, but I'm sure that ALAC had some impact. I think the main thing at that time was motor vehicle drink driving countermeasures and the presence of police on roads testing people's breath. By the time we got down to around 1998, 1999, I think the alcohol industry was starting to really get worried, lobbying the government. Dame Jenny Shipley answered the call, and we had that further turbocharge to the liberalisation. And over the next 10 years, 1998 to 2008, we had a 10% increase in alcohol consumption when we were actually on a slide in the right direction. We had the global financial crisis, which was good for alcohol, and it went down a little bit at that time, but is showing increases again. In 2008, at that height, we had a death of a liquor store owner through a knife wound in South Auckland. And look, June 2008, by August 2008, the then Labour government had called a review, a total review, a major review of the liquor laws. They acted very quickly on that. Very similar to Jacinda's very quick gun control law, very impressive. So governments can act if they want to, and they feel they can bring it in. Around that time, we decided to get together as a group of colleagues and form an organisation called Alcohol Action New Zealand. Many of you know it. These are the 5 medical spokespeople at the current time, and you'll notice Sam McBride here at the conference. Based on evidence, and we even had a website, which we thought was pretty cool in those days. I remember John talking about a WHO booklet called Alcohol Policy and the Public Good. This was back, I think, in the 80s, and he had read that. He knew all of that. These were WHO publications bringing together the world literature and informing governments, essentially, what you could do to reduce alcohol-related harm. And the latest version of this was in 2003, and it was named Alcohol No Ordinary Commodity, and then it was second edition in 2010. We read that 2003 and formed what we called the 5+ solution. Marketing, pricing, accessibility being the big 3, and age of purchase and drink driving countermeasures being very important, and the plus of the 5+ solution being to increase treatment opportunities for heavy drinkers. At that time, we kicked off Alcohol Action with a lecture series, a national alcohol series, 10 things the alcohol industry won't tell you about alcohol. And a number of you would have gone to one of these lectures. You'll notice that the first 6 things the alcohol industry won't tell you about alcohol that we chose were related to medical things. It has real risk in terms of overdose, closer to heroin than ecstasy, can cause brain damage, can cause aggression directly, can cause cancer, and the alcohol cardioprotection has been talked up. And then 3 other things: low-risk drinking causes, low-risk drinking actually is drinking low amounts of alcohol, that the alcohol industry is predative and actively markets alcohol to young people, and that a lot of the alcohol industry profit comes from heavy drinking, and therefore the alcohol industry has very little incentive to do anything about alcohol, even though it tries to be seen to be doing things. And of course, the alcohol industry doesn't want to have anything to do with the 5+ solution. When you look at the evidence for these points, pretty strong evidence, and this is in the appendix in Alcohol, No Ordinary Commodity. And if you put that alongside the public support that's actually out there in the quiet majority of New Zealand, somewhere between 70 and 80% of New Zealanders would go along with these reforms, and the government should know this. And at the time of the review of the liquor laws, this information was kept from the public by a minister at the time, Minister Peter Dunn, and I think that that's a terrible stain on his legacy, because he did other things that were positive. You would think, in the light of high effectiveness, scientific evidence of effectiveness of these interventions, and high public support in a good-going democracy, that we would get a really good reform of the law. And most of us here in this room know that the Alcohol Reform Bill, as it was called, they had the gall to call it the Alcohol Reform Bill and didn't have any reforms in it. It was 1984. Here we are. Here we're living. The dystopia where fake news and other mantra infect our public discourse. So just tinkering around marketing, nothing on pricing, a transfer of responsibility on accessibility, nothing on age of purchase, and nothing on drink driving. And that's where we were. At that time, I became really quite affected. And I think probably I shouldn't have become as I don't know, what's the word? No, you've got to be political. But I shouldn't have got so down, and I shouldn't have pointed my finger at the politicians at the time. I think that was probably a mistake. But these four men and a woman really were the political barrier to change. However, at the same time, the Labour Party and the Green Party were very quiet on this issue. So Parliament was being stymied by something. And actually at that time I became really quite cynical. And you'll remember we had a flag referendum. This was the flag that I submitted. I thought a British-American white supremacy colony and member of the Five Eyes global spy gang. You can see the little star that New Zealand is in that spy gang. But I got picked up off the floor by my colleagues, and Sam's here today. Tony Farrell, Jenny Connor, Jeff Robinson, and other colleagues and friends and family. And we're now, we've just had our 10th anniversary of Alcohol Action, and we're setting off for another 10 years. We're not going to give up. Kia kaha. One of our thoughts is to have another alcohol series. 10 more things the alcohol industry won't tell you about alcohol. Again, we could have 6 medical things. Alcohol is addictive. It causes depression and suicide. It causes over 200 different medical conditions. Decreases sexual performance. I think that would go down well. Alcohol can damage your DNA, and it causes brain damage to up to 3,000 newly born New Zealanders every year. three other things. There are 70,000 alcohol-related physical and sexual assaults every year. Something on the alcohol industry that it lobbies the government a lot more than the general public know. And they use dirty tactics to denigrate people who are just telling the truth about alcohol. And 10thly, the damaging drinking culture could be solved in 6 months. There could be a serious change in the culture of New Zealand if we did have some bravery in our parliament and some leadership. So I think we've got to really support our politicians rather than attack them, and that is what I'm going to be dedicated to over this next 10 years. However, I think that we've really got to keep up our pointing out what the alcohol industry is doing. This warning, the alcohol industry is not your friend, is actually from an editorial by Lawrence Wallach way back there in 1992. John Dobson knew about this. I think, in fact, my memory is he showed this to me, and I, to my shame, ignored it. At that time, I thought, John, what are you doing? You're a psychiatrist. You're meant to be looking after people. And you know that the industry puts $100 million into marketing. ALAC gets, just 2 or 3 million. Who's going to win this? And I was just completely cynical as to the possibility of change. Not John Dobson, though. He was up there at the select committees giving the evidence at that time. But the 4 key tactics are there, and you've read them through. And the fourth is, as I was just saying, they portray those who question us sort of people as neo-prohibitionists and other denigrating terms, and try and marginalise us. And this denigration became actually pretty personal for me. There were a number of people saying, do you ever look at the whale oil blog, Doug? And I said, what? No, I've never heard of it. And I had several say to me, don't look at it, Doug. It will spoil your day. So I didn't until Nikki Hager's book, Dirty Politics, came out. And there was a chapter, Cash for Comment, in there. And I was so surprised that it actually referred to me. And it showed a line of command, or a line of association, between Catherine Rich, who at that time was not only CEO of the Food and Grocery Council, as she's continued to be, but she was a board member on the new health promotion agency. And there's a connection between her and an intermediary called Carrot Graham, who largely did work for a tobacco industry, and Cameron Slater himself on whale oil. And there were a number of comments there. Some of the terminology I actually had to Google to find out what it meant. I was a bit shocked. And as many of you know, there's a High Court defamation case occurring at the current time. A group of lawyers approached me and Professor Boyd Swinburne and Shane Bradbrook looking at alcohol, junk food and tobacco, and some of the denigration of the three of us. 150 instances of defamation were identified. The judge has thrown out 20 of them, so there are 130 that will be judged about probably at the end of this year. We'll see what happens. Now, another possibility for an alcohol series this year might be this one. White-collar sociopaths control alcohol. Who do we want to control cannabis? Now, I've tried this out on a few people, and they think, sociopaths are a little bit strong, Doug. And I say to them, well, you've got to remember, we're all on that continuum. We're all descended from rapists and murderers, you know. We're the survivors. So we've got to be careful about identifying other people as being sociopaths. But I think there is there is a possibility that we can go down that. And I've been quite influenced recently by a couple of books, and anyone who challenges me on that title, I say, well, have you read Fishing for Fools? The Economics of Manipulation and Deception, the way big business predates young people in particular, but the whole population. And we're all children at heart. We've all got a monkey on our shoulder. We've all got a reptilian brain. And some of the very best minds out of the University of Otago are working for these big businesses to market and to persuade you to take these products which they know are going to do you harm. That's sociopathy in my mind. Joseph Stiglitz has written People, Power and Profits, Progressive Capitalism, and in some way is describing a solution, an antidote to big business and the erosion of democracy in the current world of authoritarianism and the rise of nationalism. I might just make a few comments about that later, but a couple of books to put on your list, really recommend it. I wrote a paper a few years back, in fact about 10 years ago now, the 10 most important things known about addiction. And I just wish I'd had the nous to have said the 11 most important things known about addiction, because here is the 11th, that behind every addiction there is an industry scheming to make you and your children one of their favourite customers for life. And they use all of those things that appeal to the child, the monkey, the reptile, that is part of our vulnerability as normal human beings. And when it comes to cannabis, we really wonder, I think we need to wonder who we want to be in control. Do we want the gangs, the black market gangs, or do we want the white collar gangs? Take your pick. Yeah. The white collar gangs are really cunning. Look at their marketing. US intelligence, that, and we all laugh, and I just can't help but smile when I look at that billboard, TUI billboard. Yeah, right. But as soon as we laugh, we're laughing because we get it. So we're kind of in that in-group, and they've done the job on us as soon as we laugh. They're awfully evilly cunning. So one of the things about the cannabis debate, I think, is really weighing up cannabis, and Hinimura has already done this to some extent, so I'll quickly go through this. I think here are perhaps some of the 8 most important things we need to think about: tetrahydrocannabinol versus ethanol, what the psychoactive ingredient of cannabis versus alcohol. And on only 2 of them does cannabis come out as more harmful than alcohol, and that is the risk of anxiety during intoxication, which is moderate in cannabis, low in alcohol, and known to cause psychosis, which is, yes, acutely in cannabis. I think we can say that. However, we can also say, yes, in chronic use in alcohol. I think the death from overdose is huge in terms of its safety for cannabis, and that's already been talked about. So when we look at the cannabis referendum, I think many people are thinking, are we choosing between prohibition and what we've got with alcohol, a weakly regulated, commercialised market? And the truth of it is that there is a mid-range of options. And so I think we should all be watching very carefully to what the final option that we're voting on will be. I've been enormously impressed by the New Zealand Drug Foundation and their work in keeping up with this, and as well as giving good information and some good ideas about this. But decriminalisation, a state-owned monopoly in some way, or a very strongly regulated business, as tobacco is in New Zealand, state-owned monopoly like alcohol is in Sweden, or decriminalisation like drugs are in Portugal. And I think one of the questions in my mind is this: is decriminalisation sufficient? In August, just gone, 2019, I'm not sure whether this was just serendipity or whether this was a planned thing. Most things in human affairs are just bumbling serendipity. But this may have been a very cunning move by our current government to bring in decriminalisation by stealth. But since August this year, we do have decriminalisation in New Zealand. However, and again, as Hinimura has pointed out, and I so much agree with her, there is police discretion about prosecution and a judgment about whether this is going to be for the public good or not. Cannabis convictions are about 3,000 per year running at the current time, and every one of those convictions has an impact on individuals and their whānau. Europeans make up about 50%, the figures that I saw, 41% are Māori, and if it was equitable, you would expect 15%, so there's a huge difference. We know that Māori use cannabis 2.2 times more than Europeans, so you would expect it to be a bit more than 15%. But even when you account for use, age, socioeconomic status, and other things, as has been done in the Christchurch Development Study, there is still a gap, and this gap, this worrying gap between what it should be if it was equitable across the population, is this thing called unconscious bias, or I actually prefer to actually say it as it is. It's racism. And thank you. So that's the biggest problem, I think, with our current law as it now is. We're not in a prohibition state. One of the big things that we are going to save now with soft decriminalisation, there's going to be far fewer cannabis convictions, is the millions, possibly billions of dollars that are saved through criminal justice costs saved. However, one of the biggest problems with decriminalisation continuing is the billions of dollars that are there in the black market that aren't available to us, the public, to improve the infrastructure, to improve civilization in Aotearoa. And I think this is one of the biggest problems with voting for the status quo. This is, I better declare what my preferred option is. I prefer state-owned enterprise. I think there's a real problem with private businesses. I think over time, human greed is human nature. And I can see over time, full-scale commercialisation becoming how it is over time. The really good thing about state-owned monopoly is that we, the public, own it, we get the money, but we're also paying for the costs. So there's no incentive on a state-owned monopoly to build the business as it is with a private business, because they don't pay for the costs. We pay for the costs. So the New Zealand Drug Foundation have got a pretty nifty idea about getting a state-owned monopoly between producers and sellers, which I think has real merit. But if the state has a major role in the cannabis business, I think we're going to be on safe grounds. So watch this space in terms of what the option comes up as. And that just shows you the effectiveness of state-owned monopoly for alcohol, which we can extrapolate to cannabis. Okay, now, if John was here, I'm sure we'd talk about the cholecystectomy model. That's his terminology. A cholecystectomy is a surgical operation where you go and take a diseased gallbladder out. And for most people, it's a really excellent treatment, virtually curative. And that's the way we used to think about addiction. You go and have your treatment and go and live happily ever after. just like you'd had your gallbladder out, the cholecystectomy model of treatment. And back in the 1970s, Griffith Edwards and others did a study which compared treatment, a 6-week treatment in a multimodal treatment program with all the bells and whistles, versus a one-off advice session, and then followed them up I think that was 12 months later. And the abstinence rates from the two conditions were the same. This study was replicated here in New Zealand. It was called the Wolf Home Study. And they had 3 arms, but essentially were looking at Wolf Home, which at that time was 6 weeks, bells and whistles, inpatient treatment at Carrington Hospital, and compared it with a one-off confrontational interview, as it was called. We were into confrontation back then. Thankfully, we've moved away from that with motivational interviewing. Again, the same finding was there. The tragedy in some ways, of these two research programs were that Wolf Home closed several years later, and Queen Mary Hospital went into private hands and then got closed relatively soon after. And I think we've lost a lot in our field from losing these services. But in the meantime, we've also learned a lot. And I wanted to bring George Vaillant into the discussion because John introduced me to George Vaillant. In fact, he gave me his copy of that second book on that list there, The Natural History of Alcoholism. Fantastic book, 1983. And when George Vaillant came to Christchurch, I think it must have been 1987 or 88, something like that, I went up to him, all bushy-tailed and everything, and said, "Gee, I loved your book." And he said, "Oh yeah, it's pretty good, but have you read Adaptation to Life yet?" And I was sort of slightly taken aback because I thought he'd pat me on the back and say, "You know, what a good boy you are reading my book." I read Adaptation to Life, which is terrific, and I sort of felt I could see what he was talking about when The Natural History of Alcoholism Revisited came out in 1995. And this really looked at the data and in a much more thorough way and much more cogent way. And I'm going to take you through the findings. But I'll just mention that other book. I would have loved John to have seen Aging Well, 2003, which is actually the result of another large longitudinal study called the Harvard Longitudinal Study on, you know, what a long and happy life. What brings about a long and happy life? Alcohol's in there, smoking's in there, exercise is in there. So body health is very important. But it won't take anybody by surprise in this room, I'm sure, when probably the most important outcome of aging well was the quality of your relationships over the age of 50. Your intimate relationships, your family relationships, and your relationship with communities. That's what really matters in terms of flourishing and human happiness. But the conclusions about alcoholism, I don't want to go through all of these, but just one of the ones at the top, that one at the top there, alcoholism is both a conditioned habit and a disease. And down the bottom there, the disease concept of alcoholism encourages patients to take responsibility for their drinking and helps with the whole issue of a moral guilt. So even if it's also a socially determined conditioned habit, the disease concept can be very, very helpful to many people. And you'll know that this sort of debate has not gone away. And Mark Lewis, who is a developmental psychologist, has written, he wrote a book called The Addicted Mind, talking about his own polyaddiction. Terrific book to read. He also followed that up with The Biology of Desire. Why addiction is not a disease. And I was quite distressed to see that, because I felt that this had been laid to rest. But maybe this is just the way what you have to do to sell books. It's unfortunate. And Mark Lewis and on the other side is Nora Volkoff and George Koop and others who are doing some of this fantastic work looking at addiction at a neurochemical basis. But there has been this debate started, and they've started throwing grenades at each other, these camps. Unfortunately, we're very inclined to tribalism as human beings, us and them. We're better than them people. Our God's better than your God. And we see this with this unfortunate debate at the current time. The truth is that it's both a disease and a conditioned habit, and we were told that back in the 80s and 90s by George Vaillant. Probably the thing about George Vaillant, and this is something that John really hammered home to me, these 4 big things that determine whether someone will recover or not. That long-term recovery involves some form of compelling substitute dependence, something that takes up the time. Secondly, external reminders about the negative consequences of addiction. Thirdly, a fresh start in terms of relationships. We still have to do the family therapy. We've only got one mother and a set of siblings, and addiction can really damage and erode those relationships. So family therapy is important, but it's the existence of a fresh start, new relationships, and then sources of new hope and inspiration. And whether this is the Destiny Church reconnection with an iwi or going to Alcoholics Anonymous, it doesn't matter. It's what fits for that individual in terms of inspiring them to be good people and to get into personal growth. So there's a picture of George Vaillant. He's still alive. He doesn't look like that anymore, but I think that's probably what he looked like in 1988. And he had this... I'm slightly concerned about this because it says, what is needed is that addicts, people with addiction, alter their whole pattern of living. And this has got us into, we're in the field of lifestyle change. That is the field that we're in. And I think we've all got our heads around now the idea that the cholecystectomy model is out, and that recovery from addiction isn't just changing your mind about something, having an epiphany and changing your mind. It's actually changing your brain. And this takes time. Change takes time. And the practicing of a recovery lifestyle that subsequently trumps the old addictive lifestyle is what's important. So picking up the positive pieces of your life when in acute treatment, and then assembling this new lifestyle, and then practicing it, and then making it part of ongoing self-management. Okay, finally, it doesn't pay to say certain things earlier in your career. I don't know exactly which year this was, but I said there's no such thing as food addiction. And John Dobson agreed with me, so I thought it must be true. I think, so down the track, 10 or 12 years later, after John's died, out comes the first textbook, Food and Addiction. And these wise words from Kelly Brownell and Mark Gold, a wonderful collaboration between a psychologist and a physician. Certain constituents of food, sugar in particular, may hijack the brain and override will, judgment, and personal responsibility in the same way that drugs do, and in so doing create a public health menace. The foods most likely to trigger an addictive process appear to be those marketed most aggressively by industry, which manipulates its products to maximize palatability. Sounds like tobacco, doesn't it? So that's where we are now. And looking into the future, I think that there are great opportunities. I think our field in expertise around helping people with lifestyle change, I think there's a great opportunity here with morbid obesity and food addiction that's underlying it. In recent times, I've discovered fasting. I used to think that the one difference between food addiction and alcohol addiction is that you can stop using alcohol, but you can't stop using food. Well, that's actually not true. most of us in this room could stop eating food today and we'd be just fine in a month's time. And some of us will be fine in 3 months' time. The world record for a person with morbid obesity, and he lost 120 kilograms in a continuous fast, was 382 days. So there are a number of health benefits from fasting, and look at the one at the top of the list. It's an addiction interrupter. It also it aids weight loss and weight control through various mechanisms, particularly insulin. But it also has major health benefits, producing rejuvenation, revitalization of the body, and probably increases longevity. It may prevent chronic diseases. Some of this has been talked up, and there is some evidence for it. And it may even arrest chronic diseases and possibly reverse symptoms. I've actually I'm now going to take, just close your ears and close your eyes if you don't like listening to adverts. But I've recently written a small guide, a brief guide to fasting for health, mainly geared towards people who've got a food addiction in relation to a weight problem. 5-step model, it's not a 12-step model. And I describe how to lose 60 kilograms of fat if you're interested in doing that. And if you'd like a copy of it, just email me. In conclusion, I wanted to say something about, come back to John Dobson and his combination of a passion for science and his compassion for human beings. And the thing about John was that he wasn't a religious person. When I stepped away from conservative Christianity some 40 years ago, about 40 years ago, one of my great worries was, am I going to be able to be good? Because I'd been brought up to think that good people go to church and believe in God. And one of the biggest surprises to me as a recovering Christian was there are so many good people out there in the evil world. And I've recently read this book by Steven Pinker, who is a Harvard cognitive psychologist and professor of psychology at Harvard. Enlightenment Now, The Case for Reason, Science, Humanism and Progress. And I would just have loved to talk to John Dobson about this, because he feels to me such a post-Enlightenment man. The Enlightenment has brought us this compassion for our fellow human beings, a quest for science, and a belief in human progress. Steven Pinker has talked about how life expectancy for most of the time that we've been humans was around about 30 on average. And right up to the 18th century it was 30. It's now, for the whole world, it's 71. Many people don't actually believe that, because all the news we see is so bad. You never see good news. The average life expectancy on Earth at the current time for human beings is 71. In our sort of country, it's 81. And it's only happened recently, post-Enlightenment. And violence per head of population has gone down so much. Now, Steven Pinker has actually been quite criticised by actually some of my Greenie mates. I'm a member of the Green Party. If Sir Lloyd Gearing is a member of the Green Party, if it's good enough for him, it's good enough for me. And they're telling me, don't read Steven Pinker because he underestimates climate change. And that might actually be an issue. But I'm sort of equivocal about that. But I am absolutely sure that we should be much more optimistic about the world than we are at the current time. If you had to choose a time in history to be born, either sex, into any country in the world, the best time to be born onto the world is right now. It's never been better than it is at the current time. We've got major challenges. We've got climate change. We've got nuclear issues. And we've just got to work hard as citizens to make sure that these catastrophes don't occur. humans have always felt that we're living in apocalyptic times. There's no difference. It's best to be hopeful and continue to strive to do what John Dobson did, endeavour to see the world through our patients' eyes, keep passionately reading and promoting the scientific evidence, always listening to consumers about services, be brave about speaking out on social issues, and most of all, enjoy life and be grateful for what you've got, because we're all much closer to the graves than we realise. Thank you very much.